A horrific event took place in one of the churches in Pennsylvania in October 2008. Right inside the church, a man was shot in the head. Even seasoned detectives were shocked while investigating this case. Joseph Musanta was sitting at the pastor's desk when his life was cut short. From the outside, it might have seemed like he took his own life. Joe left behind his wife Cindy, with whom he had been married for 18 years, as well as a daughter and a son. Upon learning about the tragedy, the victim's sister, Rusk, immediately came to the small town of Reedsville, Pennsylvania, where it happened. She refused to believe that her brother had voluntarily ended his life. Only the closest circle came to say goodbye to Joe. After the funeral, Rusk went to the house where her brother had recently lived with his family. The woman was surprised that there was no one in the house, neither colleagues nor friends who would support the widow Cindy Musanta. No one came to comfort her, console her, or express their condolences. Rusk began asking Cindy about their life with Joe. During the conversation, she mentioned their family pastor, Arthur Burton Shermer. The sister noticed how Cindy's eyes lit up when she spoke about this devout man. Cindy was a secretary at the church, and it was obvious to everyone that she was in love with the pastor, although the community condemned it. Cindy told Rusk that just 3 months ago, Arthur had lost his wife Betty. She was in a car accident, a deer ran out onto the road, and the car crashed into a guardrail. Betty's injuries were incompatible with life. As they continued talking, Rusk learned that Betty was Arthur's second wife, and his first wife, Joel, had also died under mysterious circumstances. She fell down the stairs, hit her head, and died. Arthur Shermer's biography frightened Rusk, and she suspected something sinister in the deaths of his wives. She wondered if such a thing was even possible. Now imagine what Samantha, Joe and Cindy's eldest daughter, had to go through. At 16, she found out about her mother's secret affair. Samantha accidentally came across a message from the pastor where Arthur confessed his love to Cindy. The girl was terrified, knowing that her father would be furious when he found out. Joe Musanta was a carpenter and, as it was known, struggled with alcoholism, fighting his addiction all his life. It was Joe who brought the family to Pastor Shermer, seeking help from the church. He began assisting with the renovation of the church, crafting wooden furniture, tables, chairs, benches, and shelves. Meanwhile, their own house was falling apart. Upon learning about her mother's affair, Samantha anonymously wrote to the pastor, pleading with him to end the relationship with a married woman. A couple of weeks later, Arthur and Cindy figured out who had sent that letter. They told Samantha that she was mistaken, denying any romantic involvement between them. The girl had to pretend that she believed them. But one day, Joe himself suspected his wife of infidelity. Samantha told him about her suspicions, confessing that her mother was having an affair with the pastor. Joe was devastated. He talked to his wife, and Cindy promised to stop communicating with Arthur, but just a few days later, the husband found out that she had secretly called her lover again. The day before Joe's death, on October 28, 2008, Cindy took the children to her sister's house, forbidding them to answer their father's calls. The man called his daughter several times, and at night, he left her a voice message, "Honey, if you love me even a little bit, please call me back, I beg you." But Samantha only listened to it in the morning when her father was already dead. The Pennsylvania police immediately started the investigation. All the evidence indicated that Joe had taken his own life. The case was assigned to Detective Jim Wagner. He carefully examined all the details, and the officer's version was confirmed. There were no traces of blood at the scene, only glass shards on the soles of Joe's shoes. He had entered the church by breaking the glass doors, walked to the hall, and sat down at the pastor's wooden desk, which he had recently crafted with his own hands. Then he took out a gun and shot himself in the head. Arthur Shermer and Cindy Musanta had an ironclad alibi. The pastor was an hour's drive away from the church, and Cindy was staying overnight at her sister's house. Immediately after Joe's death, Arthur Shermer was excluded from the church, and Detective Jim Wagner became interested in his biography, especially the information about the death of his second wife, Betty, just 3 months prior. The police considered her death a road accident. No autopsy was performed, the body was cremated the very next day after the accident, and the case was closed. It all started early in the morning on July 15, 2008. As Arthur recounted, his wife Betty had a terrible toothache. The man decided to take her to the hospital immediately. He got behind the wheel, and Betty sat in the passenger seat next to him. They sped to the hospital. Arthur was in a hurry, driving on the highway at a speed of 85 kilometers per hour, 53 miles per hour. Suddenly, a deer ran out onto the road. Sharply turning to the right, Arthur lost control of the vehicle. The car skidded and crashed into the fence. Some time passed, and another car stopped near the accident site. A man named Stan Dickerson got out of it, deciding to help the victims. Approaching Arthur's car, he asked if everything was all right. In response, Arthur indifferently said that he was fine, but his wife seemed to be in a dire situation. Stan noticed a lot of blood inside the vehicle. An unconscious woman was sitting in the front passenger seat. The witness immediately called the emergency services and reported the accident. The ambulance arrived within minutes and took Betty to the hospital. Her own sisters rushed there immediately. From the doctors, they heard the terrible news: the woman's injuries were incompatible with life. The next day, Betty was disconnected from life support, and she died. Julia and Emmy, Arthur's daughters from his first marriage to Joel, were devastated by the tragic news. They sincerely loved their stepmother. The girls couldn't even imagine that their father was hiding something. Arthur and Betty had lived together for 7 years, having married 2 years after Joel's death. Arthur said that Betty was not just a wife to him, but also his best friend and support. Immediately after her death in the hospital, the coroner asked the pastor to describe the accident in detail. He again insisted that a deer had run out onto the road, causing him to get scared, lose control of the car, and crash into the fence. There was a loud impact, the car spun and flipped over, and Betty was thrown to the side. According to Arthur, his wife was not wearing a seat belt, which is why she was injured. The case was quickly closed as an accident. Arthur told his daughters that Betty had initially buckled up. But during the ride, she suddenly complained that the belt was pressing too tightly and choking her. So she unbuckled it, and soon after, that ill-fated deer appeared on the highway. However, he told Betty's sisters a completely different story. Allegedly, his wife had not been using a seatbelt at all lately when getting into the car. She was kind of playing around, checking when the audio alert would go off. It's absurd. I don't believe it myself, because it's not like Betty at all, but that's how it was, Arthur claimed. The day after her death, Betty's body was cremated. Her closest friends were so shocked and saddened that it didn't even occur to anyone to ask unnecessary questions. No one had any suspicions. Only 4 months later, Detective Jim Wagner noticed something strange in the details of that accident. He thoroughly studied the case files, especially the photos from the scene. The images showed no signs of skidding, uneven tire wear, or braking. The car was only damaged at the front, but overall, it was in pretty good condition. The airbags didn't even deploy, so the impact happened at a low speed, while the vehicle itself was functioning properly. Arthur could have easily reversed and taken his wife to the hospital. But Betty had suffered such a serious head injury that it was simply incompatible with this type of accident. Moreover, the detective noticed suspicious bloodstains on the passenger seat that had soaked into the upholstery too quickly. If I were in a car that was being thrown from side to side, blood could be anywhere, but it definitely wouldn't have soaked into the seat beneath me, Wagner noted. This fact could only mean one thing: the bleeding Betty was put into the car before the accident. Then the detective decided to dig deeper into the circumstances of the death of Shermer's first wife, Joel, on April 23, 1999. She was polishing the stairs in the house, slipped, fell, and hit her head. Arthur was not at home at that moment, he had gone for a run. Upon returning, the man found his wife unconscious in a pool of blood near the stairs. He immediately called an ambulance. The woman was taken to the hospital, where she died a few hours later without regaining consciousness. The doctors concluded that Joel had had a heart attack. But the medical examiner who performed the autopsy refuted this version. Her heart was completely healthy. The woman had several skull fractures but no other serious injuries, especially below the neck. If she had really tumbled down the stairs, there would have been other injuries. So the expert indicated an undetermined cause of death, suggesting that it could have been a murder. He insisted that the police start an investigation immediately, but for some reason, this did not happen. Both Arthur and his daughters were convinced that Joel had simply fallen down the stairs accidentally and died. The case was closed back in 1999. But in December 2008, Detective Wagner and his team obtained a warrant to search the house where Arthur and Betty lived. There they found important evidence. On the concrete floor in the garage, the investigator noticed old bloodstains. Using luminol, forensic experts discovered a blood trail stretching from the back door of the house to the car in the garage, specifically to the front passenger seat. Further analysis showed that it was Betty's blood. That is, even before the woman got into the car, she was seriously wounded and bleeding. While Wagner's team was searching the pastor's house, the Pennsylvania police were interrogating Pastor Shermer himself. Arthur denied that Betty had ever bled in their garage. And then he suddenly remembered that shortly before her death, his wife had actually gotten injured. Allegedly, they were carrying firewood together from the garage and stacking it in a woodshed in the backyard. Old newspapers from September 2008 were lying under the pile of wood. That meant they had appeared there after Betty's death. A year later, Arthur Shermer was still dating the widowed Cindy Musanta. At first, he would visit her house on weekends, and then he eventually moved in with the woman completely. At that time, Cindy's eldest daughter, Samantha, turned 18 and moved out from her mother's place. Soon after, the girl learned that Arthur was suspected of murder and was under investigation. In the summer of 2010, the pastor proposed to Cindy, giving her an engagement ring. She said yes. Upon hearing this news, Samantha became very sad. She feared that her mother might suffer the same fate as Arthur's previous wives. The daughter tried to warn her mother about the danger, but Cindy seemed not to hear, enchanted by the priest. The police realized that they could not delay. So in September 2010, just a couple of weeks after Arthur and Cindy's engagement, he was arrested on charges of murdering his second wife, Betty. Since her body was cremated without an autopsy, the investigators questioned Dr. Wayne Ross, who had performed the autopsy on the pastor's first wife, Joel, back in 1999. He was asked to study Betty's medical records after the accident. For 3D visualization of the wounds, Dr. Ross used her CT scans. He was struck by the striking similarity of Betty and Joel's injuries. "Listen, let's be realistic," Ross stated. "What are the chances that two women will marry the same man, receive almost identical injuries to the right side of the skull, and die from them under mysterious circumstances? I think the odds are minuscule." A few months after Shermer's arrest, Dr. Ross, along with the investigators, visited the pastor's house where his first wife, Joel, had suffered fatal injuries. They wanted to check Arthur's version that the woman had slipped on the polished stairs and fallen. The team of experts repeatedly threw mannequins down the stairs, analyzing exactly how Joel could have received the fatal blow. Eventually, Dr. Ross concluded that her injuries were not the result of a fall. In his opinion, the woman was hit on the head with something like a pipe or a crowbar. Arthur's lawyer, Brendan Rice, insisted on the accidental nature of both women's deaths and called the experiments with mannequins nonsense. Allegedly, for authenticity, they would have had to throw a living person down the stairs, which, of course, no one would have agreed to. But despite this, after the completion of the examination, Joel's death was officially recognized as a murder. Arthur's daughters refused to believe that their father could have killed their mother, whose head was hit with about 14 blows. In September 2012, Arthur Shermer, who was already in custody for Betty's murder, was also accused of killing Joel. He was first tried for the murder of his second wife, Betty. The lawyer tried in every way to prove the innocence of his client, claiming that he had no motive to kill her. Shermer denied his guilt, not shedding a single tear during his speech in court. Placing his hand on the Bible, he swore to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. On January 8, 2013, almost 4 years after Betty's death, Arthur Shermer appeared in court. The prosecutor described the former pastor as a sinister monster whose life was full of deception. The main evidence of his guilt was traces of Betty's blood in the garage, the blood-soaked front passenger seat, and an undamaged stop signal button on the car's dashboard, which should have shattered from the impact. No one knew for sure whether a deer had actually run out onto the road, as the car had not hit it. But the jurors were shocked by the fact that Arthur had cremated his wife's body and chosen an urn with a deer image on it. It seemed like a morbid, not at all funny joke. A woman testified in court, admitting relationship with Arthur over the past few years. She had met him at church during a moment of emotional vulnerability. Arthur took advantage of this. Meetings at the hotel were infrequent, about 3 times a year, but it lasted for several years. There was only sex between the lovers, nothing more. The woman knew that the pastor was married. Arthur did not deny this in court. In his testimony, he admitted that due to menopause, Betty had not been interested in intimacy for several years, so the man constantly watched porn and occasionally satisfied his needs on the side. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Eventually, 64-year-old Arthur Shermer was found guilty of second-degree intentional murder of his second wife, Betty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Cindy Musanta was not accused of involvement in Betty's murder. She was only condemned for bringing Arthur into the house immediately after the death of her husband Joseph, thereby traumatizing her daughter and son, who had just lost their father. Betty's relatives felt relief after Arthur's punishment, although they realized that it would not bring back either her or Joe Musanta. In fact, if it weren't for the victim's sister, Rusk, who confirmed the doubts about the suicide and drew attention to the pastor, Arthur Shermer would have remained beyond suspicion. Only Arthur's daughters and his fiancée Cindy, who passionately defended her beloved in court, supported him. Despite the fact that the wedding never took place, the woman considers herself Shermer's wife. She closely communicates with his daughters, helps take care of the grandchildren, and considers them her own family, and this is mutual. But Cindy has almost no contact left with her eldest daughter, Samantha. What is my relationship with my mother? None. We have nothing in common anymore, she has become a stranger. This is not the mother who raised me. I wish Cindy would finally see Arthur's true face, as he really is, Samantha shared. The case of the murder of Arthur's first wife, Joel Shermer, is still open. The investigation continues. Cindy Musanta fully supports Arthur and is 100% convinced of his innocence. Thank you for watching this story. Write your thoughts about it in the comments. Don't miss the future videos, subscribe and like the channel. Take care of yourself and people you love.